Hey everybody, it's me, Mrs. Snook. I've been sleeping a lot, so I'm starting to feel a little bit better. I'm hoping to be back here by the end of this week. I'm just waiting on my test results, but I'm pretty sure I just have the flu and something like that, and not actually anything worse, let's hope. So today we're going to talk about basically what the economy was like in the 1920s, and I'm hoping that you understand a little bit more about the stock market after having played that stock market game this week. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how the stock market crashes here in 1929 and how basically some of the economic failures of the late 20s combined with the stock market crash eventually leads us to what's called the Great Depression. In this new unit that we're in, we're going to be focusing on the Great Depression, this period of an economic slowdown that's marked by high unemployment. And then we're going to be talking in Chapter 12 about the New Deal, or the policies that the government passes to try to combat, the Great Depression. So I hope that you've been working on your stock market game, that you get that done, your investor portfolio turned in, and the reflection questions. And if you haven't watched those president videos yet about the 20s presidents, Harding and Coolidge, make sure you watch those, take notes, get those done, because we're going to be moving into the Hoover president clip on Thursday and Friday. And I'm hoping to be back and we'll watch that in class, we'll talk about it, and kind of go from there. So first off, let's just talk about what is the Great Depression. So when we're talking about the Great Depression, this is considered, a huge disaster. So when we say great, it's not like it's good or it's awesome. It's great as an immense, huge, awe-inspiring. Just like when we talked about how World War I was the Great War, there was nothing good about it. There never is about war, but it was, entirely impacting how these people lived their lives. There was no way to escape it. And that's how the Great Depression is. It impacts everyone. People who are wealthy and play the stock market lose money. It, of course, impacts the middle class. And as many people aren't able to shop, their businesses close down. It impacts the poor because as those businesses shut down, they're no longer hired. Now they're on the streets. They're homeless. They're begging for food. For some people, it's going to impact them more so than others. And we're going to see differences in how it, affects people in the city versus the country. It starts in 1929 officially when the stock market crashes, and it goes really until World War II begins in 1939. So it's not like the New Deal policies passed by President Roosevelt, who comes into office after Hoover's term. We're not going to watch him this chapter, though. We might watch him probably at the beginning of fourth quarter because he's kind of a president who covers New Deal as well as World War II. So we'll watch him probably at the beginning of fourth quarter. But, really, there's no way to truly cure the depression or get us out of this horrible economic depression. And the policies are going to decrease unemployment, put more food on the table, kind of improve things, but we won't really get out of it until we go into another war era, which puts everyone back to work making war goods. It is a worldwide depression, so it's not just the United States that's going to be struggling, but everyone across the globe. And you have to understand that after World War II ended, many of these countries were devastated by, I should say, after World War I ended. I'm still not quite myself, guys. So after World War I ended, we're going to see that there's, all these economic struggles. According to the Treaty of Versailles, that peace treaty that ended World War I, Germany is supposed to pay reparations and pay for the entire cost of the war. It quickly becomes clear that they default, meaning they can't pay their loans. France and Britain realize there's no reason to invade or to attack them. They simply just want their money. And going back to war isn't really going to solve any problems. We end up coming up with this ridiculous idea called the Dawes Plan, where we loan money to Germany, and then they repay their debts to Britain and France. And then basically Germany owes us money, and Britain and France repays some of the loans that they've taken out from us with our original money. So European powers are really kind of struggling already. And then when the stock market crashes, they feel that overseas as well because basically, as our businesses are tumbling, they also had stock in some of the American companies, and it's really going to shake their faith in the American economy. Their stock prices are going to lose money as well as those stock prices drop. And as some businesses close, they're also going to have ownership in those companies, and they're going to be shut down. We're also going to put out high tariffs, which means taxes on imported goods. So we're not going to be willing to buy any of their goods either. During the 1920s, At first our economy is really slow. There's this period of demobilization after World War One, where troops are going home and people are overcoming the Spanish flu, the COVID of 100 years ago, the H1N1 virus. But eventually, the economy booms, and the 20s is about, really people who are trying to forget themselves. We see people who are drinking illegally despite prohibition, people who are trying to forget their problems. There's a whole lost generation of writers and authors in New York City, and more so in France, who are just trying to write about the fact that so many people died during the war effort and trying to drink their troubles away. Eventually, prohibition will be repealed during the Great Depression. It's the only constitutional amendment to be repealed. But ultimately, what I'm getting at is that the rest of the world was already struggling economically because of the war. And when the stock market crashes and we put up tariffs or taxes on imported goods, we're not going to really be able to help them out, and they're not really going to be in the position to help us out. We've had many other economic depressions in world history, but this is the worst. This is the longest by far. Now, what you need to understand is that a normal economy means that there's highs and lows. So in all reality, there's periods of expansion, which eventually hit like a peak. And when we're saying expansion, we mean like the economy's growing, there's new inventions, there's new ideas, new businesses are opening, unemployment is low. That eventually hits a peak, and then it starts to kind of spiral down. The reason that eventually things change, it could be that new laws are passed by the government, which makes interest rates higher. Businesses have to pay more taxes. It could be because of world wars. It could be because of things like COVID-19, like plagues. So there's various factors that kind of influence things. It's the whole idea that, you're not always going to have a sunny day. Sometimes it's going to rain. And that's what we kind of see here. So looking at this business cycle, World War I, was a time period where people had money, but, everybody was working, remember? And they even wanted women to work in men's jobs. A lot of African Americans had moved north as part of this Great Migration to take over factory jobs. And those soldiers come home, and there was a period of adjustment, as I mentioned, this demobilization, where they were angry that, women had taken their jobs, African Americans had taken their jobs. So it was kind of, there for a while there was a job shortage, honestly. And a lot of people then were put out of work because we didn't need to produce all these weapons. Women then, most of them chose to going back to being housewives and married a lot of the returning soldiers. A lot of women, though, said, my life was totally changed. The guy who I was going to marry, is dead. We said 116,000 soldiers died in World War I. So a lot of women chose to become flappers. They choose their hair short in the typical bob fashion. They do dances. They drink illegally. They smoke. They do unladylike behavior, at least what society considers, and they go off and do other things. So eventually, though, during the 20s, we see this period of, expansion, because although there was, all these changes in the beginning, where men returning to home and being angry that women and African Americans had taken their jobs, that kind of calms down. Many women will choose to quit their jobs. There's less jobs available because there's less war goods to be made, but eventually it kind of all works itself out, because all these people who come home from the war say, I've had these ideas for new inventions. Let's go back to regular life. Let's start making more consumer products so that we have an easier life. And so eventually everybody's kind of put back to work. Most women choose to stay home, but even if women wanted to work in factories, there's jobs available again, and there's new consumer products. So it's a period of expansion. And eventually you have a peak, and then what's called a recession or an economic downturn. And then if it gets a really bad economic downturn, you get a depression. You get the very bottom of that depression. It's called the trough. And then eventually the business cycle repeats. So as you're looking at this chart, if I could label it, the expansion part would be the 20s. Eventually the stock market peaks in 1929. And then it's going to 1929 into 1930. It's going to be a recession, which quickly changes into a depression as unemployment hits higher than 12%. And then really it's going to kind of bottom out into 1932 as Hoover's presidency comes to an end and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's elected. We're going to start to see it kind of slowly recover, slowly go through periods of expansion, but it still would be a much smaller expansion. In this chart, it makes it look like the peaks are the same size, it would be a much smaller peak in reality than that. We're never going to hit that same peak. We're not going to truly kind of come back out. It's still going to really be more at recession levels all the way, or even depression levels, all the way until we get to World War II. So recession is just when we've got like 6 months of, an economic decline. We're producing less goods in terms of our GDP. People are not spending things. People are getting laid off. And if the unemployment rate, usually unemployment in a recession is like 8%, give or take, maybe 9%. But as soon as you hit 12% or more, and for a 6 months period of time or greater, that's when we start calling it a depression. So right now in history, we're of course yet again in recession, triggered by COVID. We'll see if it, gets worse, if it gets better. With all the economic stimulus packages the government's been putting out, so far it's kind of stayed at unemployment levels less than 12%, for a sustained period of time. So it's been more at the recession level. They've peaked in certain areas higher than that, but national average just kept it more at the recession level. So everybody always asks, why didn't we see the Great Depression coming? Could we have another Great Depression? Yeah, we could have another Great Depression. Anything's possible in this world. Should they have seen it coming? Probably. There'd been depressions in history prior to this, and there most likely will be depressions again in history beyond this. So what were the factors leading to the Great Depression? Well, it all goes back to the 20s. And I've been kind of talking about this. That in the early part of the 1920s, everything, was kind of shaky at first. There weren't a lot of jobs available, but as the 20s went on, people were coming out with all sorts of new products. I think I've mentioned before that, toasters. Years ago, before people had toasters, literally they would take like a stick and they would toast bread over a fire, no differently than you would toast a marshmallow, which is a pain. So we're going to see new toasters and refrigerators and vacuum cleaners all coming out during the 1920s. The radio is very popular. Most people got one during World War I. And so new versions of the radio are coming out. And people all have a radio, and now on the radio there's advertisements for all of these new consumer goods, and they're convincing people that they need to buy them. It's the new form of propaganda that's out there. And there starts to be a new thought process that debt is no longer shameful. Up until this point in history, people would not buy stuff unless they physically had the cash in their product in their hands. But now we're starting to see that people are using what's called installment plans. So you buy now, you pay later. It wasn't truly a plastic credit card yet. It was more so you had like separate accounts at the grocery store, at a home goods store, and you had an account, and they wrote down what you bought and how much you paid on it and how many, payments you had left to make. And every time you went into the store, or once a month, whatever it would work out to be, you would make payments. So many people thought that, the economy was doing well in the 1920s because they looked at it and they said, yeah, everybody's working, unemployment is low. This is true, and all of these new businesses were being created. This is true, and new inventions were coming out. More immigrants tried to come to America during this time to get these jobs in factories, but the U.S. continued to, really outlaw immigrants, especially immigrants from Asia during this time. During the 20s, America was definitely isolated from the rest of the world and also incredibly racist towards African Americans and Asians and other groups during this time, as they were kind of creating their own, post-war culture. So during this time period, everything looks great. But that's just on the surface. Below the surface, you've got a society where people are, buying all this stuff in debt and going in debt to do it. So what happens if you lose your job? How are you actually going to be able to pay those bills? If you lose your job, you don't have any money in savings, and you have all this debt, it's very possible that your house is going to get repossessed. People are buying cars now. Henry Ford is using the assembly line method, where people do the same job over and over again to crank out cars at a cheap price. People are starting to move farther from the city and move out to what's going to be the beginning of suburbs to get jobs and to live in the suburbs and work in the city. So as people are buying all these goods, if they lose their job, they're going to be in trouble. The other thing is, as all these new companies come out, it really just looks like the stock market is doing well. When we look at, stock market charts, the stock market is what we call a bull market. So it is a period of time where the stock market continuously goes up because a company will, like a new toaster company, like Black & Decker, they come out with a new model of the toaster, everybody's buying it, And so since the company is making money or has high profits, the price of the stock is going up for Black & Decker. And so everybody assumes it's a bull market. And then people start to engage in what we call stock speculation. They buy now and they buy for a low price and they assume that they're going to sell later at a high price and make money. And they just had this overconfidence in the market that things are just going to go up, 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 up. So this is what we really call stock speculation. It was a way to make money fast. You buy at a low price and you sell at a high price to try to earn money. So everybody just assumed everything was great. But think about toasters in reality, okay? My family has 2 toasters. We have one in our camper, and then we have one in our house. But that's it. I think I'm not counting like toaster oven or your actual oven or a microwave. I'm just counting an actual toaster. So I'm thinking most of your families probably only have 1 toaster, maybe 2. So that's the thing about back then especially. People are not going to buy more than 1 toaster. So eventually what we're going to see happen is by the end of the 20s, people are going to say, well, I already bought a toaster. I don't need to buy anymore. And so that stock will start to slowly go down in price because it's kind of maxed out. Like people are not buying as many toasters, so the price of the stock is going to stop going up as well. And also, as people were kind of constantly buying and selling stocks, they were upping the price. They were making it seem like it was more desirable than it was, and they were willing to pay more money for the stock than it was really worth. But eventually, that's going to be a problem. Some people are so frantic to get in on the stock market that they're actually doing something called buying on the margin. So they're playing the stock market without money that's even theirs. They would go to a broker or go to a banker or someone shady. They would borrow money and then they're playing the stock market, with someone else's money, basically. So, of course, they're charging that person an interest rate. And the thought process was, well, who cares if the interest rate is high? Because I'm going to make money on the market. I can pay back, the original borrowed money plus interest and still make a profit. At least that was their hope. But that only works if it's a bull market where the stock market's going up. It doesn't work if it's a bear market when it crashes. And most Americans had very little, experience with the stock market. The other thing is, there were other indicators which said that life was good in the 20s. America in the 20s looks glitzy and glamorous with people drinking and dancing, kind of illegally behind the scenes. And there's young people who are, doing these exciting things. But in reality, the 20s has a lot of problems. We see huge race riots. We see fights for women's rights. We see, these things that are happening kind of behind the scenes. We see lots of government corruption still going on. But people kind of ignored all that and said, oh, well, life's better. And I guess in comparison to the life that they'd experienced during World War I, they were happy to be alive. They were willing to, not make sacrifices anymore. And life did seem better. So other indications as to why they would continuously play the stock market is because the Dow Jones Industrial Average, the DJIA, they're the ones who kind of keep track of the stock market. They are the ones keeping track of the stock market, and they're like, well, everything looks good. The top stocks continue to go up in price, and those businesses are doing well. The problem was they weren't really paying attention to the stock prices and the fact that the stock prices were inflated, and as I mentioned, people were paying all this money for stocks when the companies probably weren't really worth that much. They weren't really paying attention to insider trading. There was a group that was supposed to be watching kind of the stock market, but they didn't really know what they were supposed to do yet. But people keep buying stuff, but of course it's on credit. Americans keep producing goods. Our gross national product kept going up. We were selling goods all over the world. Unfortunately, a lot of those countries are also in debt, still struggling from World War I. They're not really buying a lot of our products. So for the most part, the economy looked great. Which sets us up for Herbert Hoover. So Herbert Hoover is going to come to office in 1928. As you watch the president videos, you're going to learn about how Warren G. Harding was in office for a short period of time until his death. And then we had Silent Cal, Calvin Coolidge. Both of them, as I mentioned, Republican presidents focusing on isolationism, trying to help the booming economy, letting kind of racism kind of brew in America. Still a prohibition type America that was highly religious. And then in 1928, Hoover gets elected. He is another Republican. He wins easily against Alfred Smith, the Democratic senator. He had experience from World War I and had built kind of a name for himself when he worked with the Food and the Fuel Commission. And then he served as Secretary of Commerce for President Harding and Coolidge. And he was basically like, well, see how the economy boomed in the 20s? He's like, yeah, that's all because of me. It wasn't really all because of him. It was because people were eager to buy new goods post-war because they had all this money that they'd saved up during the war, during rationing, when there was nothing to buy because it was just, men's boots and such that were being created. And new inventions were available post-war, so they wanted to spend their money. But also, as I said, the economy was not that great. The farmers were actually struggling by the end of the 20s. Some businesses were starting to decline because how many toasters will people buy? And people were buying stuff on credit. But he easily wins, and he promises Americans, I'm going to make sure there's a chicken in every pot. Everybody's going to have food to eat. Life's going to be good. It's going to be continued prosperity. Vote for me. So he gets elected. And he definitely believes in laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire meaning hands off, let it be. The government should be lazy, uninvolved, and just figure that he would continue on the policies of prior Republican presidents like Coolidge. Last slide. Now everything's going to change. Everything's going to change because as you played your stock market game, if you accidentally goofed up and started way back when the game wanted you to start in week 1 in March, that was fine. I just had you start in week 19 because I was worried that otherwise you would never get through the game. And the goal of the stock market game was to give you a little experience playing the market in case you never have before and trying to get an idea of the fact that it's complicated. Some people obviously do it for a living and make money. Now, in the game, it was easy for you to buy or sell. All you had to do was click the button. But in reality, you really only can sell stock if someone else is willing to buy it. And so if no one is willing to buy your stock at the price you're willing to sell it for, you can't sell it. And so some people get stuck with stock. That's something else to kind of mention. Now, what we see is by September of 1929, which you might have noticed in the game, stock prices started to fall rapidly. And part of the reason that they started to fall was that people started to worry that companies were doing poorly. So they started to notice, hey, wait a minute, farmers are not, able to repay their loans. They bought all these big fancy tractors during World War I. And, during the 20s, they continued to overproduce food, even though there was no more war. And Europeans aren't buying it. No one else really is either. They just have, too large of a supply, so prices have dropped. They're unable to pay their loans. They're losing their farmland. Businesses are starting to not do as well as they once did because how many toasters will a family buy? And back then it was even how many cars would a family buy? The thought process of buying 2 cars for a family was unheard of unless you were rich, especially since most families that were middle class that were buying a car, the wife did not work. So they started to realize that companies were not doing as well, and stock prices were starting to drop in those companies, which inspired people to start selling their stocks. And they were worried that perhaps the prices of the stocks were inflated to begin with, that they had stocks and they had overpaid for those stocks. The prices were still relatively high, so they wanted to sell them to still make a profit while they could. And this led to panic. Other people then began to sell their stocks as well because, if all these people are, maybe they know something they don't. Maybe they know the company's going to go under or something of that nature. So more and more people start to sell. There's also this fear that, if you don't sell when you can, how will you be able to repay your loan? Because as I mentioned, many of these people had bought stock on the margin. So they have to pay back the loan of the money they got the stock from, plus pay back interest. Now, things start to escalate, and by October 24th, which becomes known as Black Thursday, a lot of people at once start to sell their stock because they were worried about the rising interest rates. The government had increased interest rates for loans. And so people were like, oh my gosh, it's going to cost so much more money now to take out a loan to buy a house, to send my kid to school, to build a property, to buy a business, whatever it is. And so now I'm not only going to have to pay back, the original amount I borrow, plus much more interest. And so a lot of people said, you know what, this is going to come to bite me. I need to just sell my stock now. I need to get my cash. I need to pay back the banker, pay back the interest. If they borrowed on the margin, I need to get out. But the problem is that if everybody is selling at the same time, that means very few people are actually buying. And so, if you're the only buyer around, you're going to, not want to, if everybody's willing to sell you stuff and you're the only one who's actually willing to take the gamble and be the buyer, you're not going to have to pay very much money. It'd be like if Walmart and Target were all basically selling, I don't know, Nintendo Switch games, Xbox games, PlayStation games, whatever it is that you play. And if everybody's playing, selling the same game, then eventually the prices start to drop, almost like a Black Friday deal. And eventually they drop, and they get lower and lower. Now, into Friday, and then over the weekend, panic continues. And by October 29th, it becomes known as Black Tuesday. It's what we call the bottom fell out of the market. There's no confidence left in the stock market. Europe basically says they think our economy is falling apart. Some people are saying that capitalism failed. We know that some stockbrokers are killing themselves and jumping out windows. Everybody's selling. Even people who claimed that they were buying, it turns out they were lying. Interest rates continue to go up. And Herbert Hoover and the president don't really say anything reassuring because he believes in laissez-faire capitalism and doesn't feel like it's his purpose. So before you know it, 6 million shares are sold and many, many people lose their money. However, this is what really affects rich people. And this is not really going to affect people in the middle class or the poor. So does this help contribute to the Great Depression? Yes, but this is not the sole cause of the Great Depression. That's what we'll talk more about on Thursday and Friday, are the factors that lead to the actual Great Depression. Because it's not just this one alone. All right, guys, have a great day. Later.